Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual community session where we will talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, more commonly referred to as UNDRIP. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sarah Toole, and I'm the lead of the governance team at KMK. This session will focus on an overview of how UNDRIP came to be, what UNDRIP does to support Mi'kmaq rights, how Canada is implementing UNDRIP, and provide some information on our upcoming community engagements to hear from you about how you envision UNDRIP being applied in Canada. Craig Paul will be presenting this evening. He is KMK's UNDRIP advisor. He is from Eskasoni First Nation and is fluent in both Mi'kmaq and English. He's a father and grandfather who takes pride in speaking and teaching Mi'kmaq to those around him. He holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and earned his law degree from Dalhousie in 2021, being called to the bar in June of 2022. Tonight's session will be recorded and posted to our Facebook and YouTube pages. At the end of Craig's presentation, I will take a few questions from the audience through our chat feature on Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Right now, let me turn things over to Craig.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, all in. First, I'd like to say gwe to everyone. Again, I won't speak too much in Mi'kmaq, but thank you for all of you joining us this evening for our session on UNDRIP. And as Sarah had mentioned, a brief general overview of what we were doing. And I think we can start now. Amy, can you share our screen? Okay, and as I just said, this is our United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's called UNDRIP, the acronym for it. Okay, first I'll go a little over the agenda. Some sort of a roadmap on how we're going to proceed with our presentation tonight. And as you had heard Sarah, if there's any questions during my presentation, there's a chat option that you can post your chat questions to Sarah and those of us that will see the chat options. And at the end, we'll also have a period where we can get questions and answer questions. Okay, first and foremost, we will be discussing, or I will be discussing the brief history of UNDRIP, discussing where and how it got developed and how it formalized in a sense. We'll then go on to what is UNDRIP, not just the actual document itself. We'll be discussing like what UNDRIP as a whole is. And then we'll go on to discussing what is the purpose of UNDRIP, what is the general purpose, why it was developed, why is it, being used, utilized, or so forth. We'll then go into discussing I'll go into discussing the UNDRIP articles. As you can see by our screen, there's 48 of them. So there's quite a bit. They're very, some can get very complex, very in detail. But what I'll do is I'll sort of, I'll show a summary of, or the main points of each of the articles. And I'll do my best so that people will sort of get a good understanding of what the articles mean and what the articles mean to this whole UNDRIP process. I will then go into talking about UNDRIP as it has been presented and as it's been introduced in British Columbia. UNDRIP sort of on a provincial level, we'll discuss that. And then we'll go into talking about UNDRIP on the federal level, right across Canada, what it is, what it means, and how we can utilize UNDRIP. And the last few slides, the slides of our presentation, will talk about the UNDRIP itself, the federal UNDRIP legislation. And then we will go on to the community engagement, why we are here, what is the purpose we are here in this session, and what is the purpose of our initiative with UNDRIP. So that's our roadmap for this evening. And I hope you guys enjoy. All right, next slide. So generally, first and foremost, first and foremost, United Nations. As some of you may not know what United Nations is. United Nations is an international organization. It's made up of 193 countries, as you can see there. And this organization looks at various different things that are faced by issues by peoples all over the world. And UNDRIP was one of them. And they have about 4 sub-offices throughout the world, one in New York, I think another one in Geneva, and another in Vienna, and another, I can't recall at the moment. However, it's these places where these countries meet. These countries meet to discuss, problems faced by the peoples on different areas. And in the areas of UNDRIP, the rights of indigenous people, back in about 1971 to 1981, about a 10-year period, there's a report done. It was called the Cobb Report. And as a result of the Cobb Report and recommendations, the UN formed a working group to work on indigenous populations. The mandate there was to give attention to the international standards concerning indigenous rights, and they wanted to sort of develop a framework, to address these issues. As you all are well aware, there's a problem of discrimination faced by indigenous peoples, all over, not just here in Canada or the United States or North America, I should say. You get places such as high indigenous populations, such as New Zealand, Australia, and the problems that they face there, are similar to problems we face here. So, because of this issue, there was a mandate needed to address these, discriminations and injustices that we may face. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I will generally, I'll say what UNDRIP is. As I just mentioned earlier, the working group, as a result of the working group, the work they had done, there needed to be something, a resolution to be passed by the United Nations organization. And this was to come up with a document, a sort of a document that would be sort of a resolution to how we can, work on these injustices based on the rights of indigenous peoples. And this would go to a vote within the organization, a vote of all member nations. As I said, there was 193. And this document was eventually, and it came to be called a declaration. This declaration within the UN, as you see here, it's not a treaty, nor a covenant or protocol. So this document cannot be signed by all parties. It cannot be ratified. It's sort of just a declaration to be adopted and or utilized in member countries. This document, as a result, it sets out the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples throughout the world. So after, they did numerous, reports and studies to come up with this document, it would sort of set the standard, for, indigenous peoples, that would be faced with these injustices and oppression and racism. Now, they had come up with 46 articles, and these articles, talk about a lot of different areas, in these areas I'll mention, soon enough, and we'll go a little bit more detail in these articles. And like the last point there, the UN declarations are generally not legally binding. So these probably, because on international level, they could be sort of utilized in court systems, but they're not legally binding. So nobody can come to court and say, because of this document, this and this and this. But they do represent, as you know, the dynamic development of international legal norms, norms and sort of commitments to work with indigenous peoples throughout the world. All right, next slide, please. So what is the purpose? So what is the purpose of this declaration? What is the purpose of these standards that we just mentioned? What is UNDRIP? What is the purpose? The purpose is to create a human rights instrument, a rights instrument that sets out the rights of indigenous people around the world, these rights to be recognized, to be honored, to be sort of held in the highest, I want to say highest, not court, but a high stage. And would also, this document, UNDRIP document, the declaration, will also establish a universal framework, a framework that can be utilized by governments in member countries to sort of set up frameworks for minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples, throughout the member countries. As you all will know, discrimination faced by indigenous people, it is very, severe. It's very rampant. It's a reality. So again, UN, the UN nations figured, this has to be addressed. And again, UN outlines the oppression, marginalization, the exploitation suffered not only by our peoples here in Mi'kma'ki, but Indigenous people throughout Canada, Indigenous people throughout the world. So the purpose is to address these issues, to sort of resolve these issues, or at least to work towards reconciliation, resolutions, to fight this oppression. And here, again, the declaration is used to address individual and collective rights. As you all know, Mi'kmaq have individual and collective rights, cultural rights, our rights to our practices, our cultural norms, and identity, like we do have an identity, we're not, I like to say we're not, first and foremost, we're not Canadian, we're Mi'kmaq, and then as well as respectfully, any Indigenous that identifies as Indigenous throughout the country, they have that right for their, own identity. We also talk about the purpose, the rights to education, health, employment, language, and others. So generally, the purpose of UNDRIP is, to help bring us up to speed, to help us address these issues and to move on forward, on a more productive, footing. So that is the purpose of UNDRIP. Next slide, please. These next couple of slides, we're going to go over the sort of an overview of the UNDRIP articles. As I've gone through the UNDRIP declaration itself, it's very, it could be complex. It could be, each and every article can be interpreted in different ways, different forms. And so, I will not burden anybody with, the meaning of each and every one. But if you do have any questions about any of the articles, you can put them on the chat box there. But I'll do my best in describing, the 46 articles. And as you've noticed, some of the articles are sort of grouped into these subtitles. It's because they, they're predominantly talk about certain areas. So the first one, Article 1, it talks about the scope. Indigenous people have the right to collective and individual enjoyment of all human rights recognized in international law. So that means, we should be, we should also be recognized nationally or internationally. We should be afforded the same rights as non-Indigenous people, and that was our problem. We've never, we've always been not allotted that enjoyment of these human rights. Article 2, non-discrimination. Indigenous peoples are free and equal to all others and have the right to be free from discrimination. As you know, discrimination is a big contentious issue. We should be free of discrimination, whether we're at home, whether we're out on the land, whether we're out anywhere, whether it's non-Indigenous territory or Indigenous territory. We should be free of discrimination. Nobody should be discriminated against. And in the declaration, that's one of the things that they address. Now, Articles 3 to 5, they talk about self-determination. And what is self-determination? Well, self-determination is Indigenous people having the right to self-determine, and that's to determine their economic, social, cultural development, and the rights to self-government. That's a big one, self-government. This declaration, gives us the opportunity, to exercise self-government, and also the right to maintain and strengthen, our own governing institutions. So that one there, self-determination, Articles 3 to 5, discuss that in different aspects. Article 6, nationality. Indigenous individuals have the right to a nationality. Right now, Canadians, are afforded the nationality of being Canadian. Well, us Indigenous peoples, we also have the right to our own nationality, being Mi'kmaq first, foremost, or whatever indigeneity that you would use. As well, you look at Articles 7 to 10, life and security. They talk about the the right to life, freedom, peace, and security, and to exist as distinctive peoples, to belong to an indigenous community or nation, to be free from forced removal, forced assimilation, or destruction of their cultures. And this is a result, this probably came along as a result of residential schools, where we were removed forcibly. We were sort of, we were made to not talk our language. We were made to not practice our cultures. So Articles 7 to 10 address those issues, the right to life and security. Articles 11 to 13, they go on about culture and language. And culture and language, that would include indigenous peoples have the right to practice and preserve their culture and spiritual traditions and customs. Whatever culture that may be exercised by the Mi'kmaq, whatever culture may be exercised by other indigenous groups across Canada, they have that right to continue to practice these cultures and these traditions and customs, including our languages, our oral traditions. And Mi'kmaq are big on oral traditions, as you are well aware, or not, maybe you're not aware, but the Mi'kmaq practice a lot of oral culture. There is not a lot too much written, other than the hieroglyphs, maybe, out in Western Nova Scotia. So this declaration recognizes those cultural and language issues that are important and integral to us. 14 to 17, it talks about education, public information, and employment. Education, public information, and employment, what does that mean? Well, we have the right to education. We have the right to be educated, to pursue education. We also have the right, things like media, labor protections, without discrimination, and to establish and control their own education and media systems. As of now, when it comes to education, the Mi'kmaq have developed a self-governing mechanism that we sort of are self-governing when it comes to education. And this was prior to UNDRIP, but UNDRIP, we'll discuss about other things that we can, work towards self-governing systems. Articles 18 and 19, consultation and participatory decision-making. And that means Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters that will affect their lives. Things the government and UNDRIP when they make decisions on our behalf or about us, this document, this UNDRIP document, says that we have the right to participate in these decision-making matters. That's very important. Nobody knows us better than us. And I think this is important, as well as the other articles. States must consult with us. When I say states, I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about organizations, governments. They must consult with Indigenous peoples in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent. Now, that's also a big one: free, prior, and informed consent. That's sort of like a process that should be used for developing these systems. So that's 18 and 19. Can we go to the next slide, please, Amy? So Articles 2024, they talk about the economic, social rights, and vulnerable populations. This is Indigenous peoples having the right to maintain their health practices, whether it be Western health or, our own sort of health ways we sort of help within our communities, to attain the highest level standard of health, and to improve the political, social, economic systems, especially those concerning subsistence and development. So that's what that means with the health. Lands, territories, and resources, 25 to 28. 25 to 28, they discuss, the right to own and control our lands and territories. The ones that we possess already, we've owned, and even others that we may have owned. We're on unceded territory. We've never ceded any of our territory, and this sort of reemphasizes that we have the right to own and control these lands, as well as right to compensation for lands that may have been taken from us. We also, this organizations, government, states shall provide legal recognition of their lands through fair and open processes. For the environmental health, as it says, environmental health, that's to do with our traditional knowledge, conserve and protect the environment. As you know, the Mi'kmaq are very close to the environment. They grow with the environment. As you always heard, Mr. Nogma. Mr. Nogma doesn't mean, it means all my relations. It doesn't just mean my first cousins and aunts and uncles. It means the things that are around us, the animals, the plants. So, this is part of environmental health. So it's addressed here in this section. Development. Development is the right to develop our lands, our territories. So right to develop our lands and territories as we may wish. Things that are more, like that we can come up with systems, infrastructures, that sort of stuff. Self-governance, that's a big one. Self-governance, what does that mean? Articles 33 to 35 talk about self-governance. It's the right to determine things like our own membership, to promote, our institutional and judicial systems, to develop our own court systems, develop our own review boards, and to determine the responsibilities of individuals to their communities. So these articles, we have that right to self-governance of education, self-governance of social, our housing, this document recognizes we have that right, and we should be afforded that right. Sections 36, 37, treaties, international relations. And this document recognizes, our current treaties, even new treaties, the right to recognition and enforcement of our international treaties. Out here, we have, on this side of the country, we have like 1752 peace and friendship treaties, and this article reinforces that governments, should recognize and honor our treaties, and to maintain and develop political, economic, and cultural relationships across borders. So, doesn't mean, we should just be on our own, with our treaties. We should take these treaties and develop things with governments and or partners across borders. Implementation is the UN system and states should provide the necessary financial and technical assistance, meaning to implement this declaration, we should be afforded the assistance financially and technically to develop these systems, that they shouldn't just government say, okay, here you go ahead and take care of it. That's first of all so unfair. So these articles, the implementation articles, basically, they sort of recommend that governments work with us, develop financial and technical systems to help us, for legislative measures to ensure implementation of this declaration. Indigenous people also have the right to dispute resolution mechanisms to address infringements of their rights. So we should be able to develop these systems, like how we dispute these resolutions, rather than just going to the colonial government systems as they are now. And the last few articles are on interpretation. Interpretation is the rights and freedoms recognized in this declaration constitute the minimum human rights standards for Indigenous peoples, and are equally guaranteed to men and women, do not diminish any existing or future rights of Indigenous people. So they don't pose any risk to our rights or future rights. It also mentions it should be interpreted in accordance with principles of justice, democracy, and respect, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. So all these, are recommendations. These are in the article, and these are to be these are to be mentioned to governments, to adopt these articles. So those are the articles. There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack there. But I just generally went through, in a very condensed form of the articles. Can we go to the next one now, please? Okay, in this section, we'll talk about UNDRIP in British Columbia. And the reason I bring this slide in, or this tidbits of information, is as UNDRIP was developed on the international level, it was sort of, it was compelling for countries to, to adopt the declaration. It was never, they were never obligated or sort of forced to adopt it, but it was, the evidence and the research was compelling. So what happened out in British Columbia on a provincial level, prior to the national level, federal level, British Columbia went out and did their own legislative work to come up with a declaration, the UNDRIP declaration. And this was passed, as you can see here, in 2019. So prior to Canada, doing UNDRIP or implementing UNDRIP or adopting UNDRIP, British Columbia went ahead and developed their own system. As you well know, there's a lot of contentious issues out there. The Wet'suwet'en people, I can't pronounce this, Shillukut people, a lot of the forestry, the mining, the pipeline. So a lot of the indigenous people there are facing a lot of issues. So the province, came up a lot with the work with indigenous organizations, indigenous nations out there on the act, which was passed in 2019. And there were 4 key areas of the legislation there. Section 3 mandates the government to bring provincial laws into alignment with the UN Declaration. So Section 3 discusses any new laws or existing laws, they should align with this declaration, the United Nations Declaration, UNDRIP, and within the province, they mentioned that they should align. Section 4 requires the province to develop and implement an action plan in consultation and cooperation with indigenous people to meet objectives of the UN Declaration. So Section 4 describes how this process should come about. And the process is an action plan. And this is to work with the indigenous peoples of British Columbia to come up with systems, to come up with a framework, to meet the objectives of this UN Declaration. Section 5 talks about regular reporting to the legislature to monitor progress on the alignment of laws and the implementation of this action plan, including tabling annual reports by June 30th of each year. So Section 5 talks about reporting, to sort of post these results, what has worked, what hasn't worked, to make it sort of transparent, to the people of British Columbia, to the indigenous people, of what has been done and what is going to be done. Section 6 and 7, allow for flexibility for the province to enter agreements with a broader range of indigenous governments and to exercise statutory decision-making authority together. So this is more of a futuristic clause, to start now and into the future, to work with these indigenous organizations, to make a better way of correlating or collaborating on projects that the indigenous of British Columbia may have, including their cultures, their lands, their practices. So that's what those are the main ones from the British Columbia Act. And can we go on to the next slide? Now, as I mentioned, in 2019 that they passed the act in British Columbia. Now, after 3 years now, there's been reports now on how it was received, how this act legislation had been passed and what has happened since. So this slide here talks about the BC UNDRIP Act has mixed reviews since it received royal assent within the province. So there's been mixed reviews, there's been good and bad. The BC UNDRIP Act has made amendments to a couple of acts within the province to date, and the lack of progress isn't well received for BC First Nations. So they're acting very slow. It's a very slow process. There's still more to work on. But from where it started to now, it's been, maybe, the term turtle's pace, maybe. They did make a few amendments, but not enough. They have only made amendments to the BC Human Rights Code and Interpretation Act thus far in a province with over 5,000 laws. So as you all can imagine, these are only two laws, the BC Human Rights Code and Interpretation Act itself. So these are only two of many, many laws that can be amended, that can be, made consistent, with the declaration within the province. The BC government could only say it's working on a 5-year roadmap to implement UNDRIP. So the government's, response to that was, we're working on a 5-year plan, 5-year plan that in 5 years we'll still, it's working into its 3rd year now. So it'll be nice to see where it's going to go. It'll be, be sort of an eye opener to how it'll be faced nationally. So that's why I mentioned the British Columbia Act. So can we go on to the next one now? So now we come to the federal level, UNDRIP in Canada. So that was UNDRIP in BC. This one's on the UNDRIP in Canada. So on September 13, 2007, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by a majority of 143 states in favor, 4 against, and the 4 against, I had to make note of it. It would have been Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Wow, the 4 there are where the majority of Indigenous people reside and live. So these countries were against, adopting this declaration. And as you well know, it's probably because of all the things that, would work against their favor and things that would work in our favor, So they were very reluctant at first to join. However, after a while, many years and with pressure from other international countries, they eventually did adopt, formally through the UN. And because of that, Canada, lagging for a while, Canada eventually did adopt in late 2015. They didn't make it into law yet, but they officially made an announcement that they would adopt and they would commit to implementing UNDRIP. Implementing UNDRIP, as I mentioned earlier, what UNDRIP is, it's an instrument, international tool. So they said we would adopt in 2015. 6 years later, after they're saying, that they will adopt it, it took them 6 years to sort of figure out, how and where and what we can do with this document, international document. In 2021, through the legislative process, the federal government passed a piece of legislation, and it was Bill C-15, I believe, and it was called an act respecting the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Canada, at first didn't want to, vote in favor on the UN level. In 2015, after 8 years, they finally said, okay, we'll adopt this and we'll implement it. And again, after another 6 more years, it eventually came to, to the government, to the House, and it was officially made into a piece of legislation, which, for those of you that know, it's now law. It's now law that, that Canada abide by the declaration, or respect the declaration or implement the declaration. So that's how UNDRIP is now in Canada. Can we move to the next slide, please? And this slide, I'll talk about the UNDRIP legislation. An act respecting the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People affirms UNDRIP as a universal human rights instrument with application in Canadian law. So it affirms the document with the 43 articles, that they'll use this as a human rights instrument with the application of, what is now Canadian law. Canada's support of UNDRIP at the UN isn't enough to make it law in Canada. This legislation makes this happen. So, when they supported UNDRIP on an international level, okay, sure, fine and dandy, they accept and they adopted, but this didn't take effect till legislation was passed in June 21st, 2021. This legislation makes it law that the government of Canada has to make sure all other laws, policies, and regulations made by the federal government are consistent with UNDRIP. What do you mean consistent? That they follow the UNDRIP recommendations, all 43 articles. Any laws that Canada may have that may contradict these, it's recommended that they, under law, under the UNDRIPA, which the act is, that they follow this. And if you can look at Section 5, I stated Section 5 here. Section 5 of UNDRIPA states, the government of Canada must in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of Canada are consistent with the declaration. So Canada, under its own law, states that they must be consistent, with this declaration. Can we go to the next slide, please? And continuing under the federal legislation, through this law, Canada is also to prepare and implement an action plan how to address, different areas of law within different communities, within different First Nations, and to align their laws, policies, and regulations with UNDRIP, and submit an annual report on their progress. Not only are we going to an action plan mode, but whatever comes out of these action plans has to be, submitted in an annual report, an annual report which will probably be made public. Section 6.1 of the Act itself states the minister must, in consultation and cooperation with the Indigenous peoples and with other federal ministers, prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the declaration. So these articles, the objectives of the declaration, they must be implemented within this action plan. The UNDRIP Act requires that the action plan must include measures to address injustices, combat prejudice, and eliminate all forms of violence, racism, and discrimination against Indigenous peoples, promote mutual respect and understanding, as well as good relations, including through human rights education. So the UNDRIP Act requires Canada, to include these. Canada also has to consult with Indigenous communities on these changes in the implementation of UNDRIP in their action plan and reports. So within even, the processes, the action plan and the reports, they must consult and work with Indigenous peoples. So can we go to the next slide? So we now get to our last part of our presentation, the UNDRIP engagement. Okay, engagement. Canada now has to engage us. Canada has to engage us with UNDRIP. And how is this going to happen? As part of their legislation, Canada has to consult with Indigenous communities on how to implement UNDRIP in their laws, policies, and recommendations. And I know it says Canada has to implement it in their laws, policies, and recommendations. But now this time, when they implement, they're working with us. To do this, we are going to engage with community members across Nova Scotia to hear about what is most important to you. We will be going to communities. We'll be hearing people with voices on what's important, what's not important, what should we work on towards, put into an action plan that will be brought to the government. We want to hear about what is priority for you in terms of applying UNDRIP to Canadian law. What parts of UNDRIP would you like to see in your area, that Canada can, use to, or UNDRIP will use to help the Canadian change their laws. How is Canada preventing you from exercising your rights, for example? What needs to change to help your access to these rights? These are questions and many more questions that will be asked of you or by you, when we do these engagements. The last question, how do you feel Canada's rules are currently impacting you as a Mi'kmaq person? I'm sure, we can continue on, online here talking about how it has impacted us, how it has impacted our forefathers, how it will impact, our future generations. So, with this engagement, we want to hear from you. We want to come out and speak to you. We will be visiting communities in the upcoming weeks to hear from you, and this is sort of a precursor. We'll be out there. Make sure your voice is included in our report and recommendations to Canada on what needs to change and what priorities of the Mi'kmaq, of us, are for the implementation of UNDRIP. That's what our engagement is. That's our purpose. And I think that's the end of our slide. Walalio, thank you for everyone that has joined. Thank you for everyone that's listened. And if there's any other questions, please be free to ask. And Sarah will also be assisting me with answering any questions.
Thank you, Craig. It was a very informative presentation. So as Craig said, we'll now open it up for question and answers from those that are watching live. If you're watching and have a question, please send us a message in the chat window. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It might not be showing up right now. If you just hover your cursor at the bottom of your screen, it should pop up for you if you do have a question you'd like to put it there. We've received some great questions throughout the presentation, so we'll start with those and I'll monitor the Q&A as Craig's answering as we go through. So Craig, the first question is, does UNDRIP support treaty rights implementation and Mi'kmaq exercise of jurisdiction?
Okay, just give me a second here. Okay, could you repeat that question? Does UNDRIP support treaty rights implementation and Mi'kmaq exercise jurisdiction? Okay,
Yeah.
this sort of seems like a two-pronged question. So I'll answer this in two answers. For the first part, does UNDRIP support treaty rights implementation? I would have to say yes. UNDRIP supports treaty right implementation as Article 36 and 37, which I just mentioned earlier, and in the declaration itself, that Indigenous people have the right to their treaties in observance of enforcement of the treaties. So the article itself, Articles 36 and 37 within the documentation do mention this about treaty implementation. So it's a definite that UNDRIP does support the treaty rights implementation. And for the second part, the Mi'kmaq does UNDRIP support Mi'kmaq exercise of jurisdiction. The Mi'kmaq exercise of jurisdiction would fall under self-governance and the right for the Mi'kmaq to develop these systems with the UNDRIP legislation as our tool. So yes, it also supports Mi'kmaq exercise of jurisdiction. And in what areas, that's what we'd like to know when we do our community engagements. So I hope that answers, that question. And if we can go to another question, Sarah.
Sure. Next question is, what mechanisms hold Canada accountable to the principles of UNDRIP?
What mechanisms hold Canada accountable to the principles of UNDRIP? Well, the most important mechanism that I could think of that will hold Canada accountable to the principles of UNDRIP is that Canada, as of June 21st, 2021, which I mentioned in my presentation, had passed legislation. It made law to adopt these principles into amending and or making laws in correlation with Indigenous people of Canada. Now, at the international level, there is nothing except the pressure of other member nations to hold Canada accountable. There's pressures from other countries, Canada, you should do this, Canada, you shouldn't do this. However, the legislation in Canada holds the government accountable to implement UNDRIP to their laws and policies by requiring the public annual progress report on how they are implementing UNDRIP. So not only are they required by law, their own law, to implement UNDRIP, they're also required by law to report on how it's implemented these laws. So Canada would be accountable, yes. And these are the mechanisms: UNDRIP, the UNDRIP, declaration, as well as UNDRIPA, which is the act that Canada had passed in 2021. Next question, Sarah.
Thank you, Craig. Does the wording of Canada's legislation pose a risk to our rights?
That's a good question. Does Canada's wording of legislation pose risk to rights? And as as a lawyer, we're very often, wary of how things are interpreted. How each word can change, change the the law or change, the argument. Well, in this sense, Article 45 of the article of the UNDRIP, which I just mentioned, explicitly states that nothing in the declaration itself may be construed as diminishing or extinguishing the rights Indigenous peoples have now or may acquire in the future. So the implementation of this document, which Canada has made law, which has adopted this document, or to use as guidance, states that nothing should, construe or diminish, our rights. The legislation by Canada UNDRIPA would contradict this specific article. So if Canada is going to, implement and recognize the document itself says nothing's to, diminish or extinguish our rights. Nothing's to pose a risk to our rights. That said, the legislation itself under section 2.2 states the act is to be construed as upholding the rights of Indigenous people recognized and affirmed by section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, and not as abrogating, which means getting away with the rights, or derogating from them, which means making the rights less important, inferior. So within the act itself, UNDRIPA, section 2-2 or 2 sub 2, states in itself that, we're going to, recognize and affirm section 35, which is also another act within Canada. So the wording, I'd say, doesn't not pose a risk to our rights. Thank you,
Great.
Sarah.
All right, Craig, as you were speaking, I pulled some more questions and I sent them to you in our chat so you can see them laid out as you try to remember all the pieces of each question. So I'll ask them, but know that they're there for you to reference in case you forget part of the question. And so a community member asks, on Article 6, when I applied to for my passport, I hesitated to answer the question about nationality. If we have the right to nationality, why isn't it accepted if we put Indigenous?
Good question. Thank you for the question. Yeah, right now we're not too far into the process where we can implement those changes yet, but with the UNDRIP tool necessary, we can have those talks. We can have those talks with our leaders. Our leaders can have talks with their leaders and work on, being recognized, whether we put Indigenous on there. And I think it's too early to say now where this will, go morph into, but hopefully one day, we may eventually, maybe, and don't quote me on this, but maybe we may have our own citizenship and passports.
Thanks, Craig. I think that's a great recommendation that we can bring to our engagement sessions as well and include in our report. So thank you for that question. It's leading to some great conversations.
Thank you.
The next question is, in Section 4 of the British Columbia Act, does the way it is stated mean that politicians will be consulting with Indigenous people in creating the plan? Does their law require Indigenous peoples to consent or only be consulted?
That's also a good question. Thank you for the question. As I just, on the surface, looked at the BC Act, and I do know I did mention in my presentation the UNDRIP Act in BC. Section 4 requires the province to develop and implement an action plan in consultation with corporation of Indigenous peoples. I think it's stated like that when they come up with a plan, that this plan should also include Indigenous participation. That it shouldn't be a plan developed and sort of developed and implemented just by themselves onto Indigenous people, but the Indigenous people should also be included in the plan making, in the decision making. And that's what I believe. I could be wrong on that, but I haven't I haven't delved in too much into the sections of the British Act. I only brought it on this presentation as sort of an example of what's being done across the country. So I hope that answers one of the questions, and I will try to do further research on that one as well, just in case we face the same question within our community engagements.
Thanks, Craig. I think it's important to note as well that UNDRIP itself says that Indigenous people have the right to free, prior, informed consent. So if British Columbia is operating their consultations on UNDRIP and their action plan to implement UNDRIP in good faith and under the principles of UNDRIP, then that consent should be absolutely a part of that work.
Correct, Sarah.
The next question is, how do you hope the adoption of UNDRIP by Canada will affect the Indian Act?
How do you, that's a great question. That's a question I really didn't think too much. How do you hope the adoption of UNDRIP by Canada will affect the Indian Act? Well, the Indian Act itself is legislation. It's been around for such a long time. It's, I would dare say, has a lot of flaws with it. I think it may still hang around as government isn't wanting to remove it. And there's pros and cons to it. And I know a lot of people often think about the cons of it. However, UNDRIP, as I said earlier, is an instrument, international instrument tool, which we can, maybe counteract any of the acts that the Indian Act may bring. Indian Act is a law. I mean, the Indian Act itself is a law itself, and it has many different sections. Well, with the adoption of UNDRIP, I think, we're starting out on a better footing than we did with the Indian Act. I mean, we had no say in the Indian Act. The Indian Act was developed, as you know, to sort of control and to sort of minimize our role, within our own, territories and lands. So I think UNDRIP at least comes out saying that, we're going to develop these plans with you. We're going to be looking at what's, priority with you, and we're going to be developing laws that directly affect you. Whereas the Indian Act itself didn't do any of those. The Indian Act wasn't consulted with our peoples. The Indian Act is very discriminatory. There's a lot of things in the Indian Act that should be, and have been repealed. So I hope that answers your question. With the hope of the adoption of UNDRIP, it will affect the Indian Act. How it'll affect the Indian Act is going to depend on these many community engagements across the country.
Thank you, Craig. I think that's a great point. That's I think my apologies. I think the Indian Act is one of those big pieces that are front of mind when we're speaking about UNDRIP, and especially in aligning federal legislation. It's one of those pieces of legislation it's very easy to point to say that that's not aligning with UNDRIP. So for the community member who asked that question, I encourage you to come to our community engagement sessions if you're able to. And if you're not, if you're able to complete our online survey, which we hope to have out tomorrow, if not just after the weekend, we'd love to hear your perspectives on what you hope to see change in the Indian Act as well. So Craig, the next question I have here is, with Canada adopting UNDRIP, does this mean that each province and territory is totally supportive?
With Canada adopting UNDRIP, is each province could you repeat that last part?
Are all of the provinces and territories totally supportive of UNDRIP?
I certainly would hope so. It's been done on international level. It's been done in BC. So there's room for it to be eventually accepted across the country, provincially and federally. So I don't know where it's at now. I know there's been mixed reviews. There's been hesitancy, in adopting, on UNDRIP. I mean, within our own territories, people are sort of unaware of what UNDRIP is. And that's my hopes, is in gaining people's attention and bring them to light what UNDRIP can and would be. So, if this presentation helps somebody to spread the word of, what UNDRIP can be used for, that may, have a ripple effect to the provinces and on the international level. And one day, hopefully, it will be just, an everyday thing that UNDRIP is there to stay, and UNDRIP hopefully being accepted across. So there's mixed reviews, there's mixed reactions, as it's early in the game, but at least now, we're involved, right from the get-go.
Thanks, Craig. I think you're absolutely right about the ripple effect. So the Canada's legislation doesn't hold the provinces accountable to do the same thing, and it only applies to the application of federal laws, policies, and regulations, like you've said. So there really is no meat and bones to make the provinces be supportive, but we're hoping that as provinces see how well UNDRIP can be applied to Canada's laws and how much better the nation is for it, and how much better Indigenous communities are off once these legislation and policies are reviewed, that they'll follow suit as well. So I think you're right on with the domino effect happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. So I'm sorry if we didn't answer your question. I will hope to follow up by email after or through our community sessions. So our last question for this evening is, have Indigenous people in BC been asked what laws they hope to prioritize to revise?
I believe they have been. They're still working on their action plan. As I said, in the next 5 years, they're working on their action plan. So I believe that they're being consulted. There's probably more consulting to be going on. And that's on a provincial level. As we all know, there's a lot of contentious issues there. There's a lot of issues need to be raised on the provincial, parliamentary level and on the national level. So to answer your question, and I can't give you a definite answer, but I certainly hope they were consulted. As UNDRIP itself mentions that, they should be consulted. So, I would hate to for them to be infringing already on this, UNDRIP Act. We don't want to start off infringing already. Absolutely.
And it's important to note that we don't have all the answers on BC's process. We're doing our best to learn and share that information as we go along. And so we can't speak to all the pieces of how BC is implementing their action plan and their legislation, but we can say that Canada's process on the federal legislation is nationwide, and communities across Canada have been funded to do the same work we're doing, and they're in the exact same engagement process as we're doing. So at the very least, Indigenous people in BC will be engaged on their perspectives on prioritization of the federal laws through this process as well, and they'll be reflected in the same reports as what our community members share as well. So with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us tonight, and thank you, Craig, for your time and your fantastic presentation. It was very informative. I think it really set the stage for us to go on some great community engagements. We're already hearing some fantastic questions and fantastic ideas from community members in our Q&A section. So I'm really excited for us to get started on those community engagements and hear from community directly. If we didn't get to your question tonight, or if you had questions you'd like to ask after we close, or if you're watching this recording and you have questions, please feel free to email them to us. Craig's email should be available on our website. It'll be available on all of our social media platforms. It was available on the poster advertising this evening's session. And if all else fails, you can't find his email, you can always email at info@mi'kma'rights.com and we'll put you in touch with Craig. So thank you again, everyone, for coming out. We appreciate your time this evening and all of your very thoughtful questions and input on UNDRIP.
And I'd like to just to say, in me, Mark, well audio.